Welcome to this video. Thank you so much for tuning in, sharing in this now moment with myself and with one another. If you haven't seen these videos before, welcome back if you have. My intention is unity and oneness. This is part 2 of a video that I did. I haven't titled the other video yet, but I'll do a little recap of that video. And then my intention is just to share through this diagram, my beautiful artwork, some of the messages I've been receiving in regards to what's happening as we are going through this ascension journey. So if you're not sure what ascension is, I guess it'd be kind of fun to look up what they define it as, but I'll share with you my interpretation. Yeah, okay, so if you look it up, they talk about it, of course, in the religious texts, ascending. You'll hear it referenced to moving up, essentially. I like to think of it as more expansion. And somebody mentioned it here as awakening, I guess. I feel like the word awakening is, there's layers of awakening and there's layers of ascension. So it's these layers essentially that we are growing and expanding through. And what I'm being shown is that, it's a fun way for me just to interpret what my guidance team is sharing with me. And part of me didn't want to share this because I thought, well, if I want this information, I could just read Walter Russell, which, by the way, I still have to read Walter Russell. I never have. I'm sure that he's probably already talked about this. I could just listen to Dan Winter. I could just listen to Robert Edward Grant. So those are 3 teachers. Walter Russell is no longer living. But you could listen to those other 2 that I'm mentioning because they share from their perspective, which is an educational, mathematical, musical, electrical engineering background. So they really are, and the only reason I'm mentioning them is because when I first started getting this information, one of you beautiful subscribers to my YouTube channel was the one who pointed them out to me. Have you ever listened to such and such? This is what you're talking about. So while I do listen to them still, and I highly recommend if you're not familiar with any of their material, just to give it a try, and also inviting anybody watching this to just really come from an open heart and open mind. My intention is just to share how I receive the information and how I interpret it, because it's fun for me, and I might have something different to add than to what they're already talking about. And then combining all of those, part of what this journey, from my perspective in ascension, that we're all doing is we're all different pieces of the puzzle. So for me, I receive this information from the energy that moves through all things that we are all connected to. From my perspective, it's coming through us as conduits, and essentially our DNA is quantum, and everything is connected. So for whatever reason, my field, I pick up on a lot of this quantum communication about physics and things like that. And I do my best through synchronicity. And that's why I'm sharing it. How I do it is I learn this through listening. And then I realize, oh, this is actually a real thing. What is that? And the more curious I am, and the more listening I do, the more I learn. And it's just a fun interaction to better understand the world around me from my perspective. And I change my perspective based on my experiences. We all do. So I'm learning as I go. So I'm welcoming you on this journey as well. Thank you for joining me. The recap to the previous video I did talking about ascension is we're in a space right now, and it is, they're saying that a lot of people have rocks in they're walking around with rocks in their shoes. And as they're walking around with these rocks in their shoes, they don't realize, and all of us have done this, that we've changed our walk because of it. And they were describing these rocks as being blocks or beliefs, thorns in our side, right? And essentially this has been the way we've done it. Well, and we became accustomed to being walking in a particular way. Now, what they're showing me through thermodynamics and some other things I'm going to try to figure out as we go, we are ascending. And so our system has upgraded. Now, from a multidimensional perspective, this has already happened. From a linear perspective, we're going through the process, okay? And so we are shifting and our bodies are changing. So a lot of the patterns that we're holding on to, and this can be mental, emotional, physical, spiritual, what is the other one? Causal, can't remember what that word. But anyways, it can be any of those. So maybe it's a belief about us, or maybe it's a pattern that we've adopted because we've adapted to these rocks that we've been walking around carrying in our shoes. Now all of a sudden, they're heating up. And this is what my guides are. So I'm using metaphor and analogy here to try to explain. So now these rocks are heating up. And they're not only in our shoes, they're in our bodies, they're in our thought field. I was shown like musical notes. Some are at a lower scale, some are at a higher scale. And so they are creating vibratory patterns. And in addition to that, they're creating interference. A lot of the references my guides are using is around sports. So these interference patterns that have been in our field, we've just gotten used to them, but we don't need to anymore from one perspective. We don't need the rocks. We never needed them, is essentially what the guidance team is saying. But we maybe felt like we had to believe this story, or we felt like we had to carry this burden. We felt like we needed to understand this concept. And so we bought into a particular idea about reality. And that actually created an interference in our knowingness. And so we adapted and we changed the way in which we viewed or perceived. They kept saying it's changed our gate. And I know that that's going to end up being a play on words at some point, because it had to do with electricity and gates. And so I know I should go back and really study some of these teachers, but I'm not going to, because otherwise I would just take all of my time studying and I wouldn't take time exploring my own consciousness and then comparing the two, which is something I encourage everybody to do. Have you ever taken a class and you listen to one teacher and it makes no sense at all, and then you have another teacher on the same subject and you're like, oh, I'm not saying that's what's going to happen here today. But for me, I've realized that each of us holds value. Each of our perspective holds value, because even if we don't agree on the same subject, how we learn, how we interpret, and how we influence each other is really important in our growth and ascension journey. So that is part of why I do these videos. So, full disclaimer, right? I'm just going to go for a little recap, and I'm just going to share with you what I drew. Then I'm going to go through with some of the things I wrote. We're going to talk a little bit about combustion. That's the word of the day. So that was my previous video, which again, as a recap, I thought combustion meant explosion, but it actually means, I think, to burn. So there is something about this right now. A lot of us in the spiritual community have heard alchemy, right? Well, obviously if you're in the scientific community too, but from a woo-woo standpoint, we're like, oh, we're alchemizing and we're shifting and we're integrating our emotions and our realities. I guess that's not very woo-woo, but you get where I'm going with this. We don't necessarily dive into what alchemy really represents. But the word or the energy that is happening from my perspective right now, it's different for everyone, by the way, depending on where people are at in their journey. The guides talked a lot about layovers. That's a play on words too. I kind of forgot about that. We'll have to come back to that. So layovers, but that has to do with flying and traveling and all of that. Okay. So and different paths. So some people, because of their circuitry, because of the rocks in their shoes, because of how many rocks they've collected in their shoes that they haven't realized, it might take them longer to burn through those rocks or to dissolve them, if you will. And we're really being called to be patient with the process, whether it's our process or someone else's. Number one. All right, so what I was being shown was a reference to we're in a different energetic space. Literally, the energy within which we are sitting, the aether, okay, the frequency, the bandwidth, the charge is different. Therefore, the viscosity and the velocity, all of it has shifted. And again, apologies, I'm not explaining this for you science buffs out there. Just bear with me because I'm using a lot of wordplay here. So how we are operating within that medium, right, of air, of dimension, of density has also changed and is changing. So my guides were like, some people are going to go straight to the end and they're going to be like, hey, what took you so long? Others of us are really taking our time. So what I'm just going to say what I was shown. Again, what I'm shown is I'm diving into a collective of frequencies and energies. I don't remember if I said this, of just multidimensionality. It's my curiosity and my imagination that brings in this information essentially, and going into my heart. That's key. And so combustion has a lot to do with compression, and compression has a lot to do with the heart frequency, which we'll probably talk about in a different video. What they shared is baseball, diamond, pitcher, higher range, catcher's mitt, stopping the energy, holding it. I'll call that my parentheses. Human polar wave, self-conductivity, signal is received, caught, then dissipates, which also we're going to play with that word. We're going to talk about igniting a fusion, brain signals, and fluted through a tube. Ooh, all kinds of good stuff. Chemistry, basically. So I drew a little picture of this last time of a person inside of a tube. And so always keeping in mind, as within, so without. So we have tubes inside of our body. We have mitochondria, we have cells, we have combustion going on, cell mitosis, all of this stuff going on in our bodies, right? This is also happening all around us in the fields. Our body is a medium, the field around us is a medium, and the chemistry within this field is shifting. I kept the sun up here because we are having a lot of radiation, more so than we've ever had in the time period that many of us have seen. And also we've had a lot of earth changes. And essentially, think of the earth as a body. Think of this air and ether and the elements as an also kind of a living entity. Earlier, I think I said this, we essentially think of all of us as waves, and we'll use this little guy in this tube. So all of this is around the body, tubes are in the body. We're going to start with that. We're on this musical scale. The scale also has to do with physics on the density and the length in which the waves travel. And we're sending out these notes. Each of us is like a snowflake that has a signal, a font, a signature, a pattern. So we'll go back to the rocks in the shoes. The rocks in the shoes we could call interference in our pattern. Many of us have been operating in a field full of interference, and we can't help but interfere in this field, whether we think it's holographic or not. Our brain is firing, the synapses are firing, we're having electrical energy moving through our body. And as within, so without, it's also moving in the field all around us. Think of an ocean and what happens when dolphins make bubbles, right? That's how they catch their meals, or whales. So we could think of sonar, think of the high clicks and pitches that go through the water and that communication. We can learn a lot looking in the ocean and how all of the animals interact with each other and apply that to our on land reality. But it's a different viscosity, it's a different energy. So the quickness and the way the sounds are produced well, the way the sounds are produced are very similar, but how they travel through the field is obviously different. And how we interpret that field, how we interpret someone else's voice is also different than it might happen in the ocean. But we are similarly using our own sonar. I'm going into a totally different bubble right now, but it's relevant. How we then receive the signals and then we give our feedback into the field. And this is all creating interference, right? So this shifts where the patterns travel to, how fast they travel, what is, and the energy that's carrying that also shifts in response to us. From my perspective, that's my simple way of describing what's happening in the field. So what I was shown is that, let's go back to this tube. We're in this space, we're sending out this musical note, and how far we carry our charge, how much energy we're building up, is what allows us to essentially create our sound to move through the distortions. Something has shifted to where our bodies are chemically changing and combusting. There are things happening inside of our body, Kundalini explosion, whatever we want to call it. The mitochondria, the DNA, all of it is shifting, all of it is changing. Part of the reason we're seeing the Mandela effect so much, I encourage you to look that up if you're not sure what it is, because we are having a different experience. We're having a different reaction to our experience in this reality matrix. So if we're at a low hum and we don't have a lot of energy and we don't have a lot of charge, it has a completely different sound and signature and font than someone who has a higher pitch. What the guides are saying is we've reached a higher pitch, and that is not just in reference to sound. There's been a new element, the fifth element, that's been created. There's a new sound that's been created, and we are all responding to that. And I'm not going to get into which came first, the chicken or the egg. Just play and pretend it all happened at once. So we're making adjustments to this pitch, if you will. And because this new element has been introduced, this new energy has been introduced into our form, it is changing the form in which it's being introduced, because we are interacting with it. And just like a wave or a particle, once a particle interacts with something, it changes. So it's inevitable that we would shift according to all. So this is part of this growth. Let's just go right into, so I hope that makes sense. So this is kind of what I'm seeing on the scale. Now, the sun is creating more heat, obviously, and this is part of our growth cycle, right? I'm being shown the Venus flytrap. Basically, when the Venus flytrap is growing, it wants like 12 hours of sun. And when it's taking downtime, it only wants 4 hours of sun. We've requested growth. Here we go. Be careful what you ask for, right? The universe has responded and is like, here you go. There will be repercussions to that, because what happens when we grow? Growing pains, right? We have to grow into our bones. We have to grow into this new way of being. And this is part of what's happening. We can't take our rocks with us that are in our shoe. Why would we want to? So now as we remove these old patterns and introduce new patterns, we start to adjust and we start to balance things out that were severely out of balance before. But what happens is we're starting to see what was seriously out of balance before. And so we're starting to move through those distortions with more ease. I know it doesn't feel like it. I know there's a lot of distortions, and anyways. So let me go into what the guides were sharing and we'll break it down a little bit. So the first word that came through, they were showing me a baseball field and a baseball diamond. I actually have to go back and look at my previous video because some other words came through that I didn't write down. But we'll go into combustion first. And combustion essentially is burning. So we are going through a burning right now. And doesn't it feel like that a little bit? Like things are heating up, not just from the sun, but between our relationships with people. Conversations are heating up. Things that it's like, get rid of it, burn it. We don't need it anymore, you know? What do we do when we burn sage? For those of you out there, we're shifting the energy around it. We're clearing out and changing the frequency to kind of disrupt the disruption, right? So combustion or burning is a high temperature exothermic redox chemical reaction between a fuel, the reductant, and an oxidant, usually atmospheric oxygen, that produces oxidized, often gaseous products in a mixture termed as smoke. Complicated, right? So basically you light a match, you burn something, a fire, smoke is created. It doesn't always result in fire because a flame is only visible when substances undergoing combustion vaporize. But when it does, a flame is a characteristic indicator of the reaction. How many of us have heard about that internal flame, right? While activation energy must be supplied to initiate combustion, like a match, the heat from a flame may provide enough energy to make the reaction self-sustaining. My guys are talking about self-conductivity. So part of what we're watching right now, as a recap, is things are happening so that we can become less, well, distracted is one thing, less reliant on an activation energy. And I talked in my previous video about activation, right? So let's go into that briefly as well. I'm just laughing because it's calling it the RNAS model. Look like Artemis. Anywho, inside joke. Is the minimum amount of energy. So activation energy must be supplied to initiate combustion. So let's use like kind of an analogy with that, right? Or a metaphor, both maybe. So we're all being activated, right? How many of us feel like the changes that are happening in our lives we're putting out fires, right? We're putting out fires with this and we're dissolving that, and that's just vaporizing what right in front of us. And what we thought was really important, the next day we're like, did that even happen? Poof. I keep seeing poof, poof, right? So the interpretation of this is we're going through this so that we can be self-sustaining, so that we don't necessarily have to have this cause and effect all the time. We can start to initiate our own activation through inner self-awareness. But currently, part of what's activating or initiating us into self-awareness is what we're witnessing going on around us from a social perspective. But also what's happening is we have these ahas as we become curious and interact with our environment, with each other. We ask questions, we spark our interests and feed our internal flame or desire. This creates a chemical reaction in not only our body. Think about reducing serotonin. We produce all of this because of this. So we become self-sustaining, right? We're following our passion, and therefore it's ignited within us versus us having to go jump out of an airplane to really feel alive. Not to say that you might be a skydiver. That's great. That's part of your enjoyment. That's part of your joy that helps you to release that serotonin. But that's not something we need all the time because we have it within us. The other interpretation of this is, so what's happening is we've got this combustion going on, and we're constantly being activated. This isn't always feel like a positive thing. right? We go someplace and someone is angry. I experienced this the other day, and I honestly didn't realize, because I wasn't really focused, I got a little triggered by it, that I was feeling, I didn't realize this until later, which was very valuable for me. I was feeling their anger. And it might very well have been that they weren't angry at me, they were just angry. And then they unleashed their anger, right? And so this is what's happening. I'm witnessing it not only in little things in my world, but I'm seeing people be very unpleasant to each other. And so that can be activating for us, unfortunately. So let's come back to this. So let me just pause. So as I do this, I'm tuning into words that are popping into my awareness and words I've written down that I don't fully understand. Even if I've looked them up before, it doesn't mean I've retained or remembered them. So it's like I'm learning something new all the time. Not all the time, but most of the time. So what I'm drawn to look at here is, oh, I already highlighted it, so now it's gone. Boop. Is incandescent. My guides have used incandescent a lot in plays on words, ink and writing. So incandescent, and by the way, I'm on Wikipedia playing with this. Thermal radiation is electromagnetic radiation emitted by the thermal motion of particles in matter. All matter with a temperature greater than absolute zero emits thermal radiation. Oh boy, this takes me to lattice oscillations. I'll come back to that. Now, I'd also like to point out that we've got fires going on. We've got volcanoes, right? A lot of activity in the earth. So it's kind of a theme, fire, right? And so I think this is a double meaning as well. Okay, and I think what's happening, the other thing that my guides are showing me is that we're creating new elements. There are new elements. If you guys, I'm not going to talk about when I went through high school and college, but the periodic table of elements is not the same that it was then. And the way in which you look at the periodic table of elements with some schools, they've shifted that as well into a more three-dimensional, four-dimensional kind of look, instead of just this linear idea of what it means. And I think Robert Edward Grant, maybe Dan Winters, I'm sorry, I'm confusing, one of them has talked about, and it might be through Walter Russell now that I'm thinking of it, what the periodic table of elements should really look like. So I should probably look that up. Okay, maybe I will. Oh yeah, okay, I forgot about this. I highly encourage you to look up the Walter Russell periodic table of elements. It's fascinating. Okay, we'll just do that really quick. Okay, so I'm sharing screen right now, and I don't know if you can see this. I'm not sure if it's big enough, but isn't that cool? Some of you guys are like, okay, Carrie, we've already been there, done that. But, it's helping me make sense of something that I should have looked at. So I had drawn the cube, the hypercube, and you probably can't see it. I might need to screenshot this, take a picture of it, and then zoom in on it. This is awesome. So I see the S curve, right? You're seeing all of these elements. It's like a musical scale almost. And so I feel like I need to dive into this a little bit. And then to the left, for whatever reason, which I'll have to look up, it is, okay, so I'm on currently medium.com, but it looks like you can also go to philosophy.org, maybe look it up just to play with this. And I'm sure that this is going to give me, it says the spheres are based on atomic radius. Okay, this is going to be like mind-blowing. And it also says that it's based on the wavelength spiral. Okay, so essentially what I'm being shown is that as we expand, we are extending our wavelength, and that changes the notes on the scale. It changes the notes that we're creating, how we're creating the notes, what the sound of our radius is like, and the field in which we're expressing these sounds and how it feels in the field as we go through these changes. So a lot of people that just are feeling really off, it's because we're different. We're not the same we were. We're not vibrating at the same rate, speed, sound, distance between realities. So it's almost like we have to learn how to interpret or read the field differently than we ever have. So it's not only a challenge physically, but it's a challenge to all of our senses to really shift how it is we operate in this new medium. So it's kind of like I keep being shown an artist working with a new medium. That artist might be an expert with clay, but then you give them a paint and a paintbrush and they're like, what do I do with this? So we're not all experts at this yet. So I'm being kind of shown that as an example. Okay, and I'm going to share screen one more time. Well, I'm just going to say I encourage everybody to look that up. I'll do some more research on it as well. But one of the things my guides are saying is we've reached a different pitch. So if you look at that Walter Russell diagram, it has to do with octaves also. It has to do with sound. And to me, it looks like time. It's got this spiral, right? If you were to look at it as a multidimensional, it's not just an S, it's a curve. It's an infinity, right? It's loops like a chain of information. And so essentially we're moving up this spiral, which means we're coming into contact from another perspective with new elements. We're changing how it is that we come into contact with this, because the energy that we're holding inside of us is changing. And now I'm hearing thermodynamics. So I'm going to get back into thermodynamics and maybe I'll tune into this other stuff later. So I still want to see what that cube was all about though. So why thermodynamics? But let me just pause for a moment. You guys, I just have to share before I move out of this page really quick. I encourage everybody, I'm going to share screen. This is kind of cool. This is what curiosity, this picture. Look at that. This was off of Wikipedia. I just clicked on it because I was like, what is microgravity? Doesn't this look like a part of the human anatomy? Just saying.